300 people in the room. Every one of them certain they already know who she is. She has been in this house for 3 years. Marble floors. Fresh flowers every Monday. A table with 14 seats, where they speak a language they are sure she cannot follow. They have said things. Specific things. The kind of things people say when they believe no one who matters is listening. She has written down every word. Date. Time. Exact language. The leather journal behind the handbags in the back of the closet is almost full. Tonight she is wearing red. The podium is 30 feet away. The microphone is on. The room is full of the particular comfortable noise of people who have never once considered that the quietest person present might also be the most prepared. She stands up. The noise does not stop immediately. It takes 3 seconds. Then it does, and she begins to speak. Linda Brown had exactly 3 minutes before the car arrived. She knew because she'd set a timer, because that was the kind of woman she'd become inside this house. The kind who times things, who measures, who counts down in silence while everyone around her assumes she's simply standing still. The red dress hung on the back of the bathroom door. She'd bought it 6 weeks ago and hidden it in a bag inside the trunk of a car she'd rented under her own name, paid in cash, returned before Anthony noticed the mileage, not because she was paranoid. Because she'd learned, over 3 years inside the Wilson household, that the things you want to keep are the things you keep invisible. She pulled it on now, adjusted the straps, looked at the mirror like it owed her something. It did. The woman looking back at her was 30 years old. 5'7", dark skin, clean edges, the kind of face that made strangers look twice, and then pretend they hadn't. She'd been told she was beautiful so many times and in so many wrong contexts that the word had lost its weight entirely. Beautiful to the Wilson family meant useful, presentable, a particular kind of decoration that photographed well next to marble countertops and charity event backdrops. She was so much more than that. She'd always been so much more than that. And tonight, in exactly 3 hours and 40 minutes, 300 people were going to find that out whether they were ready or not. She picked up the small folded paper from the edge of the sink, opened it, read it once quietly, her lips barely moving. Notes written in Spanish. Not the polished textbook kind. The real kind. The kind that came from somewhere older than any classroom she'd ever sat in. The kind her grandmother, Mary Smith, had pressed into her when she was barely tossed enough to reach the kitchen counter in a house that leaked when it rained but never, not once, ran out of language. She folded the paper back up, slid it into her small clutch, then took it out again, set it on the counter. She didn't need it. She hadn't needed it since she was 22. She'd brought it tonight because Mary couldn't be in that room, and this was the closest thing she had to her grandmother standing next to her. The timer went off. Linda Brown picked up her clutch, walked out of the bathroom, and did not look back. Mary Smith was 83 years old and had never once in her life told Linda Brown to be quiet. Which made her the exception, which made her the only person Linda had ever fully trusted with the unedited version of herself. Mary had come up in Louisiana, the kind of Louisiana that doesn't appear in travel brochures. The kind with unpaved roads and front porches that tilted slightly to the left and never got fixed because there was always something more urgent. She'd raised Linda after Linda's mother moved to Houston, and her father turned into someone else entirely. She'd done it without complaint and without ceremony, which was another thing that made her exceptional. But what Mary gave Linda that no school, no scholarship, no degree ever could, was this: she gave her language as survival. Not language as performance. Not language as a party trick or a line on a resume. Language as the thing you reach for when everything else has been taken. Mary treat them with kindness. Spree spoke 3 things fluently: English and Louisiana Creole, and a strain of Spanish that had been passed down through the Black Creole community of New Orleans for generations, a living artifact of a history most Americans had never been taught. She spoke all 3 at the kitchen table, switching mid-sentence without apology, because that was how she thought. That was how she was built. And that was how she built Linda. By the time Linda was 6, she was following conversations in all 3. By the time she was 10, she was answering back. By the time she was 13, She'd asked Mary to help her get Spanish language books from the public library, the advanced ones, the ones with the worn spines and the pencil annotations, from people who'd read them before her. By the time treat them with kindness. By the time she was 17, her Spanish was clean and deep and native in the way that matters, the way that lives in the body rather than the brain. Howard University gave her the formal architecture for what she already knew. 4 years studying language, economics, and the intersection between the two. She graduated at the top of her class. Not close to the top. At the top, with a thesis on multilingual negotiation in domestic commercial real estate markets that her advisor described as the kind of work that usually comes from people 20 years further into their careers. She'd spent 2 years after graduation working at a consulting firm in Atlanta, developing market access strategies for companies trying to reach communities that major corporations had historically ignored or misunderstood. She was good at her job. Exceptionally good. The kind of good that other people in the room notice and then, depending on who they are, either celebrate or resent. She met Anthony Wilson at a charity event in Manhattan, a fundraiser for an arts organization. She'd gone with a colleague. He'd been working the room in that specific way that men who've grown up in money work rooms, which is to say easily, with the kind of ease that comes not from confidence alone, but from never once having been made to feel like you didn't belong somewhere. He looked at her like she was the only person present. She'd found out later that was a skill, something he'd refined over years of business dinners, and donor cultivation events. At the time, she thought it was genuine. She thought a lot of things at the time. They dated for 8 months. He proposed at a restaurant that didn't list prices on the menu. She said yes. She meant it. The night before the wedding, sitting in the hotel room while her bridesmaids slept, she'd called Mary. And Mary had said what Mary always said when she had something important to give Linda, which was that she said it slowly and only once, baby girl. The thing you know that other people don't know you know. That's the most powerful thing you have. Don't spend it early. Linda had not fully understood what her grandmother meant. Not yet. She understood it now. She understood it completely. The Wilson household took approximately 4 months to reveal what it actually was. The house itself was Upper East Side Manhattan. 4 floors, 12-foot ceilings, a kitchen that had been featured in a design magazine 2 years before Linda moved in. Fresh flowers delivered every Monday. A housekeeper who came 3 mornings a week. A service elevator with kindness that nobody used except the delivery people. And, apparently, Linda when she needed to bring groceries up without having to pass through the formal entry. Nobody told her to use the service elevator. It was more subtle than that. It was the kind of arrangement that establishes itself through accumulated small signals rather than explicit instruction. A look here, a redirected question there, a seating arrangement at dinner that never quite put her at the center of anything. Patricia Johnson was 65 years old and had the bearing of a woman who had decided decades ago that the world would accommodate her and had been proven right consistently enough to make that decision feel like a law of nature rather than a preference. She was beautiful in the particular way that certain older black women are beautiful, the kind of beauty that has sharpened rather than softened over time. All cheekbones and precision, and a gaze that you felt before you made eye contact. She wore her age the way she wore everything else. On purpose, Patricia was, on paper, the former chair of Wilson Property Group's board of directors. She'd stepped back from the official title 3 years before Linda arrived. In practice, she had stepped back from nothing. She still had an office on the 14th floor of the company's Midtown headquarters. She still attended every major deal review. She still made the decisions that mattered, and Anthony still called her before he signed anything with a comma, and more than 6 zeros after it. He called her Mom in private and Mrs. Johnson in meetings, which told you everything you needed to know about how the power in that family actually flowed. Patricia had chosen Linda for Anthony. This was the thing Linda didn't know for the first 18 months. Not chosen her the way a mother chooses a daughter-in-law, with warmth and hope, and the particular tenderness of wanting good things for your child. Chosen her the way a director casts a role. Wilson Property Group was expanding. They were moving into neighborhoods, communities, and business relationships that required a different face than the one the company had been presenting for 30 years. Would you treat them with kindness? The board had been having conversations about image, about what the company looked like from the outside, about the markets they were missing because of who was in the room and who wasn't. Linda Brown was young, and she was beautiful, and she photographed beautifully next to Anthony at events, and she came from a background that read as diverse, without being complicated. No political affiliations, no public controversies, no family drama that could surface in a profile piece. She was, as Patricia had reportedly described her to a board member in a conversation Linda would not learn about until much later, exactly what we need on the wall right now. The wall. Linda had been inside the Wilson household for 2 years before she heard that phrase. When she did, she wrote it down in Mindus, in the leather journal she kept behind the handbags in the back of her closet, and she wrote it in Spanish, because old habits are the ones that keep you safest. And she wrote it in her own handwriting, which was small and precise, the handwriting of someone who had always taken notes like she expected to be tested on them later. Turned out she was right about that too. The Sunday dinners were where it was most concentrated. 14 seats, every chair filled with Wilsons or Wilson-adjacent people, the kind of extended family network that forms around money over generations. Anthony at one end, Patricia at the other. Stephanie Harris, Anthony's younger sister, 32 years old, and the kind of beautiful that came with knowing it, seated always to Patricia's left. Various cousins, business partners, longtime family friends filling the rest. They talked, constantly, in English mostly, but when Patricia wanted to have a conversation that wasn't for Linda's ears, she switched to Spanish. Not because she was fluent, she wasn't. Her Spanish was functional, hospitality level, good enough to have basic exchanges with the Spanish-speaking contractors and property managers who worked Wilson's buildings. Would you treat them with kindness? But it was good enough to say things to Anthony and Stephanie that she didn't want Linda to understand. And she did this with a consistency that suggested it had become comfortable, a habit formed over the confidence of 3 years. Linda understood everything. All of it. The first Sunday that Patricia switched languages, Linda had been in the family for less than 3 months. They were passing the bread, and Patricia leaned toward Anthony and said in Spanish, casually, like commenting on the weather, "She holds herself well enough. I'll give her that. But she doesn't belong here, and everyone at this table knows it." Anthony said nothing. He passed the butter. Linda reached for the bread. Her hand was steady. Under the table, her left thumb pressed into the pad of her index finger until she felt the nail. She said, "The rolls are wonderful. Did Rosa make these from scratch?" And Rosa, the housekeeper, who absolutely did not speak Spanish, and therefore was not the person Patricia was trying to exclude, said yes and looked pleased. That was the first time. There were hundreds after that. She signed the papers without reading them. Anthony's lawyer said she didn't ask a single question, like handing a permission slip to a child. That one was a Tuesday evening, 6 months in. Patricia on the phone, Linda in the adjacent hallway, walking past with a glass of water. She slowed down, kept moving, filed it, even the way she walks in this house, like she's trying not to take up too much space. Doesn't she realize that's exactly what she's doing? That one was at a birthday dinner, spoken in Spanish to a woman friend of Patricia's who'd glanced at Linda with the particular expression of someone doing a private calculation they'd rather not be caught doing. It won't be permanent. Nothing like this ever is. That one was brief. Spoken by Anthony himself on the phone, half visible through the crack of the study door. In Spanish. Directed at nobody Linda could see. She stood in the hallway for 4 seconds, then continued to the kitchen. She started the journal on a Tuesday in October of their 2nd year. She'd gone to 3 stores before finding the right one. Not leather that was too soft, too decorative. The kind of journal that announces itself. Something with weight. Something with a spine that would last. She bought it at a small stationery shop near her old gym, paid cash, brought it home in a plain paper bag, and slid it behind the handbags in the back of the closet before Anthony came home from his evening meeting. She wrote the first entry in Spanish. Date, time, location. What was said? Who said it? The exact words, not her paraphrase. Because she'd learned in her consulting days that paraphrase is where memory starts to lie to you, that the only thing worth recording is the precise original, the thing nobody can later tell you misremembered or took out of context. She kept writing. The journal grew. It grew slowly at first, then with more regularity. Would you treat them with kindness? Because once you start truly listening in an environment that assumes you aren't listening, you realize how much has always been happening around you. Patricia directing the housekeeper in Spanish to reassign Linda's preferred parking spot in the building garage. To a visiting cousin, explained as a logistical necessity, never mentioned to Linda directly. Anthony telling his sister in Spanish at a family cookout that Linda was, quote, easy to manage, no demand, no complications, exactly what I needed right now. Stephanie laughing and saying in the same language that Anthony always did have good taste in furniture. Furniture. Linda had looked at Stephanie for a moment after that, just a moment. Then she'd refilled her drink and gone to talk to someone else. She'd written it in the journal that night, the word and the timestamp and a single sentence underneath it. I am keeping count. The thing about keeping count, the thing nobody tells you, is that it has to stay invisible to work. The moment you let them see you counting, they adjust. They become careful. They close the doors and lower their voices and stop giving you material. So Linda stayed invisible, which, conveniently, was the one thing the Wilson family was already determined to make her. She was not invisible in the places that mattered. She was meticulous about that. Would you treat them with kindness? She knew Anthony's passwords not because he'd given them to her, but because he entered them in front of her constantly, without any awareness that she was paying attention. Because why would he expect her to be paying attention to a string of numbers on a screen when she was, in his mental model of her, focused on whatever background domestic activity she was engaged in? She never used the passwords. She didn't need to. She photographed what was visible. She listened to what was audible. She filed what she witnessed. And every Friday evening, would you treat them with kindness? She photographed the new pages from her journal and emailed them to herself through an account set up on a separate device that stayed at the stationery shop where she'd bought the journal. Would you treat them with kindness? Because the owner there was a woman in her 70s who'd known Mary Smith's kind of resilience when she saw it, and who had never once, in 14 months, asked Linda what she was doing there. She met Vanessa Carter through a friend of a friend, the way you meet the people who actually matter, not through official channels or professional directories, but through the particular web of trust that Black women build for each other across professional sectors. Vanessa was 45, a family law attorney with a particular specialty in high-asset divorce cases, the kind that take years and generate more legal documentation than most people produce in a lifetime. She had the build of a formerfness. She had the build of a former athlete and the eyes of someone who had heard everything at least twice and remained unshocked by all of it. Linda had called her, given her name, and said, I'm not ready to move yet, but I want to understand my position. Vanessa had been quiet for a moment. Then, smart, come in on Thursday, we'll talk. They'd been meeting quarterly for 8 months. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa knew about the journal. She knew about the passwords Linda hadn't used and the documents she had photographed and the recordings she hadn't yet made but was prepared to make. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa had walked her through exactly what New York law permitted a spouse to do within their own residence, which was more than most people realized and less than what drama had led Linda to expect, a narrow but workable corridor of legal conduct that Vanessa knew better than almost anyone in the state. One-party consent, Vanessa had told her in their second meeting. You're present in the conversation. You can record it. That's not a technicality, that's the law. Use it correctly and what you're building is a record. Use it incorrectly and it's nothing. Learn the difference. Linda had learned the difference. She'd read the statute herself, 3 times, in the original legal language, and then had Vanessa walk her through it again just to be certain. Because certainty was the only currency that mattered now. This was not revenge. Linda needed people to understand that, even if those people only ever existed inside her own head. This was not the plan of a woman who'd been wounded and was striking back. This was the plan of a woman who'd been recruited into a role she hadn't auditioned for, and was now, calmly and systematically, declining to play it on someone else's terms. The anger was there. She wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But anger was just fuel. Fuel was only useful if you had somewhere to drive. She had somewhere to drive. James Carter had come into the picture 14 months ago. He was 58, a business strategist and longtime advisor to Wilson Property Group, the kind of man who'd been in every important room in New York commercial real estate for 30 years without ever wanting his name on the building. He moved through the world quietly. He watched things. He noticed patterns. He'd been the first person in the Wilson orbit to look at Linda with something other than dismissal, not warmth exactly, but a quality of attention that felt different from the ambient indifference she'd become accustomed to. The first time he'd looked at her like that was at a company dinner 14 months ago. Patricia had leaned toward Anthony in the middle of a table conversation and said something in Spanish, quickly, the kind of statement you make when you think you're safe. Linda hadn't reacted. Not visibly. But James Carter had been watching the table, not the conversation, and he'd seen the almost nothing that crossed Linda's face for a fraction of a second before she settled back into pleasant neutrality. He hadn't said anything then. He was the kind of man who didn't say things until he was ready to say them well. He found out the truth 8 months later, on a Tuesday evening at the Wilson house, when he'd wandered down the hallway, looking the bathroom and heard Linda in the den speaking on the phone. In Spanish. Fast, fluent, completely unrehearsed Spanish. The kind that doesn't come from classes or apps or 2 years of high school conjugation. The kind that is simply part of how someone thinks. He'd stood outside the door for a full 90 seconds, not eavesdropping in the way that word implies, but understanding something, recalibrating, putting together pieces that had been floating separately for over a year, and watching them settle into a shape that was both simpler and more remarkable than anything he'd suspected. When Linda ended the call and stepped out, he was still in the hallway, not pretending to be doing anything else, just standing there, because he was old enough to have stopped pretending. She looked at him, waited. He said, "How long?" And she said, "Before I could write my own name." They stood in the hallway for another minute, not talking, just letting the weight of it sit between them. 3 years of Sunday dinners. 3 years of Spanish spoken openly over her head. 3 years of being treated as ambient furniture in her own home. James Carter exhaled slowly. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Then he said something that had nothing to do with sympathy and everything to do with the way men who've been in too many rooms full of dishonest people learn to recognize honesty when they finally encounter it. "I've suspected something was wrong with Wilson's financials for almost 2 years. The numbers don't line up with what I know about their portfolio. But I don't have what I'd need to act on it, and I haven't been willing to risk 12 years of relationship on a suspicion." He looked at her directly. "I think you might have what I'd need." She said, "I know what I have." He said, "When the time comes, you won't be standing alone." She thought about Mary Smith in a house in Louisiana with a tilted porch and a roof that leaked. She thought about the word her grandmother had used, spend it. Don't spend it early. She hadn't spent it early. She hadn't spent anything yet. But the account was full. She felt it. The weight of 3 years of documented precision sitting in a leather journal behind her handbags, in photographs sent to a private account, in Vanessa Carter's files. Would you treat them with kindness? In the growing certainty that she had been underestimated by people who should have known better, and that their underestimation had given her exactly the access she needed to make sure they couldn't do it to anyone else. She told James, "I'll let you know when I'm ready." He'd nodded. No more was needed. Neither of them was the kind of person who needed more. And then there was the night Patricia came home early. This was 4 months ago. Linda had thought the house was empty. Anthony was in Chicago for meetings. Patricia had a charity event. Stephanie was with friends. The housekeeper had come and gone by noon. Linda had put her daughter down for a nap and done the thing she almost never allowed herself to do inside these walls, which was to simply exist without performing. She'd called Mary. She'd talked for 40 kindness. She'd talked for 40 minutes in a combination of Creole and Spanish and English. The three-language blend that was her actual internal voice, the one that existed before she'd learned to compress herself into a single register for the comfort of the people around her. She'd laughed. She'd sworn a little, the way you only swear with people who have known you since you were small. She'd told Mary about her daughter's new habit of clapping whenever she heard music, and Mary had laughed that specific laugh, the one that was part joy and part relief, and part something older that didn't have a name. She'd been still sitting there, one leg tucked under her, the Spanish novel she'd been rereading open in her lap, when she heard the front door. Patricia. Home early. Linda had moved fast. Not in a panic. Panic was visible, but in the quick, efficient motion of a woman who had spent 3 years knowing that certain things about herself needed to stay out of sight. The journal went behind the handbags. The Spanish novel went under the bed. She was in the kitchen, kettle on, looking like someone who had simply been sitting quietly in their own home, which is in fact what she had been doing, just not the version of it that was safe to be caught doing. Patricia had come in, taken off her coat, looked at Linda with that particular look, the calibrating one, the one that was always trying to assess whether anything had changed. Then she'd said in Spanish, half under her breath, to no one in particular, the verbal equivalent of leaving a coffee cup on a counter. Still here. Somehow. Linda had said in English, I made tea. Would you like some? Patricia had said no and gone upstairs. But that night, after everyone was asleep, Linda had written that one down too. 2 words. Date and time. And beneath it, in smaller letters, she is waiting for something. I am waiting for the same thing. The difference is she doesn't know what I know about the timeline, because she'd overheard it. 3 weeks before that night, Anthony on the phone in the study, door 3/4 closed, speaking in Spanish, and this time not casually, this time with the specific precision of someone confirming an agreement rather than having a conversation. Once the Williams contract closes, we move forward. The lawyers are ready. She hasn't looked at the paperwork once, doesn't even know what she signed. The Williams contract. Robert Williams. $12 million. The deal Anthony had been building for 18 months. The deal that apparently was the trigger. Linda had stood in the hallway outside the study for 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Would you treat them with kindness? She had noted the time on her phone, then walked to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water and stood at the window, looking out at the city lights until her pulse returned to its resting rate. Then she had gone upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and called Vanessa. Vanessa had answered in 2 rings. It was past 10. She answered anyway, which was one of the things Linda appreciated about her. Linda told her what she'd heard. Vanessa was quiet for a moment. Then, do you have the recording? I didn't have time to start it. I heard it mid-conversation. Okay, that's fine. From this point forward, phone stays within reach. You're present in that house every day. You'll get more. I know I will. Linda. Vanessa's voice had something in it that was more than professional concern. How are you? Linda thought about how to answer that. She thought about the glass of water she'd poured and stood over for 5 minutes. She thought about her daughter in the next room, 2 years old, dark eyes, that caught light in a way that made Linda's chest do something complicated. She thought about Mary Smith on a tilted porch in Louisiana saying, "Don't spend it early. The thing you know that they don't know you know." I'm ready, Linda said. I've been ready for a while. I just needed a room big enough to matter. The room, it turned out, was 3 weeks away. 300 guests. A podium. A microphone. Every person who'd ever written a check to the Wilson family, or shaken Anthony's hand at a deal closing, or smiled at Linda across a dinner table, while Patricia said something devastating in a language they didn't realize Linda spoke. That room. She hadn't slept well since. Not from fear, from the specific alertness of someone who has done all the preparation and is now simply waiting for the starting line to arrive. She'd reviewed the journal twice. She'd met with Vanessa 4 times. She'd connected with Monica Reed. The journalist James Carter had introduced her to Would you treat them with kindness? The woman who'd been circling Wilson Property Group's financials for 6 months from the outside, and who'd nearly stopped breathing when Linda showed her what she'd been able to document from the inside. Monica had spent 2 weeks independently verifying everything Linda had provided. Bank statements cross-referenced with public records. Emails confirmed through secondary sources. The narrative was airtight. Monica had told her, "You're not the source, you're the center of gravity. Everything I have orbits what you know." Linda had appreciated the precision of that. She thought about Robert Williams, 50 years old, sharp, serious, the kind of man who remembered every detail of every business interaction he'd ever had. He would be at the event tonight. He'd been invited months ago, before any of this, because the Wilson family needed him in that room for reasons that had nothing to do with what was about to happen. But Linda had thought about him carefully, because she remembered his face when the deal nearly collapsed 6 months ago. She'd been in the kitchen, Anthony in his study with the door half open, because Anthony had stopped thinking of Linda as someone who processed what she heard. The call with Robert Williams's team was going wrong. Fast. The Spanish-speaking legal team on Robert's side had caught a discrepancy between the executed contract and the term sheet. A translation error that had turned 15% into 50. Robert Williams's voice through the speaker had gone from professional to cold in the space of 2 sentences. Anthony was nodding and saying yes, and looking like a man watching a car accident in slow motion. Linda had written the correction on a piece of paper torn from her daughter's coloring book, section, page. The precise language of the original term. She'd slid it under the study door without knocking. Walked back to the kitchen. Heard the conversation shift, Anthony reading her note haltingly into the phone. The pause on the other end. The sound of papers being pulled. The moment of recognition. 20 minutes later the call ended and Anthony had found her at the kitchen counter. "How did you know about that clause?" "I saw the contract on your desk last week." The number looked off. "I Googled the original term." Anthony had looked at her for a moment, the look of a man whose mental model of someone is being brushed up against by evidence and doesn't quite know what to do with the friction. Then, "My wife, the Google detective." He'd kissed her forehead and walked out. That night on the phone with his mother, in Spanish, she Googled her way into saving the deal. Pure luck, but it worked. Patricia, even a stopped clock. Linda, folding laundry in the room off the hallway, had pressed her thumbnail into her index finger and kept folding. Robert Williams had shaken her hand at the deal closing 2 weeks later. He'd looked at her with the particular directness of someone who'd already privately revised his assessment of a situation and was acknowledging the revision without making a speech about it. He'd said, "I look forward to working with your family." But he'd been looking at Linda when he said your family. Not at Anthony. At her. She thought about that look now, standing by the window. Would you treat them with kindness? 2 hours before the car would arrive to take her to the event. She thought about how much information a single look could carry when the person giving it understood more than they were letting on. She thought about James Carter in that hallway saying, "You won't be standing alone." She thought about Vanessa saying, "This is a record." She thought about Monica Reed saying, "You're the center of gravity." She thought about her daughter in the next room, asleep. Both tiny fists curled against the blanket, the way she always slept, like she was holding on to something she wasn't ready to let go of. Linda walked into the nursery. She stood by the crib for a moment, just looking. 2 years old, and already so certain about herself, in that specific way that very young children are certain before the world starts telling them to be smaller, before the voices start accumulating. Would you treat them with kindness? Linda put her hand on the crib rail and made a promise to herself that she'd been building toward for 3 years, but had never quite said out loud until now, in the dark, with no audience, which is the only place promises mean anything. Not one of those voices. Not one day. She walked back to the bathroom, looked at herself in the mirror again. The red dress, the earrings she'd chosen herself, the face that had been called beautiful and decorative and easy and furniture and never, not once, in this house, been called what it actually was. Ready. She was ready. The timer was still on the counter. She looked at it once, then left it there. She didn't need it anymore. She walked out of the room, Downstairs the car waited. Word count 3,891, wait running self-scan. I have not yet reached the required minimum. Continuing directly. 3 years inside the Wilson household had taught Linda Brown a specific and transferable skill that had nothing to do with language or law or the meticulous documentation she'd been conducting since October of her second year. It had taught her how to move through a space that was trying to erase her, how to be present in a room without triggering the particular anxiety that powerful people feel when they sense someone watching them too closely, how to be still enough that you became part of the background without becoming nothing. It was, she would think later, the most useful and the most infuriating thing she'd ever learned. Useful because it had given her access. Infuriating because she'd had to learn it at all. Patricia had not made it easy. That deserved to be said plainly. Patricia Johnson was not a careless woman. She was not sloppy or thoughtless. She was, in most respects, formidably intelligent. The kind of intelligent that builds and sustains a real estate empire across 3 generations. What she had was a blind spot, one specific, structural blind spot, and it was this. Would you treat them with kindness? She had organized her entire understanding of the world around the assumption that the people she deemed beneath her were also beneath her attention. She had made a calculation, probably decades ago, and probably without ever examining it consciously, that the effort required to truly see someone was proportional to their perceived status. Would you treat them with kindness, and that anyone who appeared to be less than her was therefore not worth the effort of genuine perception? This was her flaw, and it was, as flaws go, a devastating one. Would you treat them with kindness? Because it meant that the most important thing happening inside her household for the past 3 years had been completely invisible to her. She'd been performing her dismissal of Linda so thoroughly, so consistently, with such confidence in its invisibility, that she'd never once stopped to consider whether Linda was performing something back. Anthony was different in mechanism, but arrived at the same result. He was 38 and had grown up knowing he would inherit something. Not in the lazy way that phrase sometimes implies. He worked hard. He was genuinely skilled at the business of real estate development. Would you treat them with kindness? He could read a market analysis or a construction timeline with the attention of someone who'd been trained to notice what mattered, but his capacity for paying attention was selective in a way he'd never had to interrogate. He paid attention to deals. He paid attention to money. He paid attention to other men in rooms with money. He had never developed the habit of paying attention to the people who, in his internal hierarchy, did not require his attention. And Linda had fallen into that category on their honeymoon, and stayed there. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd understood this about him within the first 6 months. It had hurt, the way certain truths hurt, not because they're surprising, but because you'd been hoping you were wrong. She'd hoped, in the way that people hope against accumulating evidence, that she was seeing something that wasn't there, that the pattern she was detecting was a misread, that the man who'd looked at her like she was the only person in a Manhattan ballroom was somewhere still in there, just underneath whatever he'd allowed himself to become inside, the context of his family and his company and his own increasingly comfortable assumptions. He wasn't. Or if he was buried so deep underneath all of that she couldn't reach him anymore. And she'd stopped trying to reach him sometime around month 18, when she'd realized that the project of trying to make Anthony see her was consuming energy she needed for something more important. The more important thing was her daughter. Her daughter was 27 months old. She had a name that Linda had chosen and Anthony had agreed to without particular interest, which had been its own small signal. She had her mother's eyes and her father's last name and a laugh that could reorganize the feeling of a room. Would you treat them with kindness? Linda had spent 2 years making sure that whatever happened inside the walls of this household, whatever accumulated in the air of its Sunday dinners and its closed-door conversations and its service elevator arrangements, none of it touched her daughter. Not the tension, not the specific quality of being unseen, not the lesson that some people's language was legitimate and some people's language was to be corrected out of them. That had been the line. The moment that had moved Linda from patient, methodical waiting to something with an actual deadline. Patricia had come home early on a Thursday evening 6 weeks before the gala. The house had been quiet. The housekeeper gone for the day, Anthony at a dinner downtown. Linda had been in the nursery. Her daughter was drifting towards sleep, and Linda had been singing, the way she always sang to her, in those particular private moments, in the multilingual blend that was her actual native tongue, the Louisiana Creole Spanish mixed with English that Mary had given her, the thing that lived in her body before language had a name. She hadn't heard Patricia's footsteps. She'd only known Patricia was there when the singing was done, and she'd turned to find her mother-in-law in the doorway, expression arranged into something that was trying to look neutral but wasn't. What language is that? It's just something my grandmother used to sing. It sounds like Spanish. Parts of it. Patricia had been quiet for a moment. Then she'd said, in a voice that was doing a great deal of work to sound reasonable, Anthony and I were talking about Lily's development. We think it would be better, for consistency, to keep her environment primarily English. Children get confused with too much language at once. She said this to a woman who spoke 4 languages, without any awareness of the irony, because she had no idea who she was talking to. Linda had said, of course. She'd said it the way she said everything in this house, neutrally, agreeably, with a stillness that people read as compliance. But something had shifted in that moment. Not the plan. The plan was already in motion. What shifted was the urgency. She called Vanessa the next morning, not at night. In the morning, from her car, parked 2 blocks from the house with the windows up. I need to move faster. Not recklessly. But the timeline needs to compress. What happened? She tried to take my daughter's language. Vanessa was quiet for 4 seconds. Then, tell me what you need. You treat them with kindness? What she'd needed was the Williams deal to close, because that was the trigger, and she couldn't move before the trigger without revealing that she knew what she wasn't supposed to know. She'd needed 3 more weeks of documentation. She'd needed Monica Reed to finish her independent verification. She'd needed Vanessa to complete the prenuptial analysis, the 62-page brief that was going to be the spine of everything. She'd gotten all of it, quietly, efficiently, without a single visible signal that anything had changed. Now she was in a red dress in the back of a car watching Manhattan slide past the windows, the city lit up and continuous, every block carrying its own compressed history of who had power here and how they'd gotten it, and what it had cost and who had paid. She thought about Mary Smith, about the porch that leaned. Would you treat them with kindness? About the hundreds of books in a house where the roof leaked. About a woman who had come from nothing that the official version of American history had any interest in, and had decided, without anyone's permission or encouragement, that her granddaughter was going to have everything that could be earned through intelligence and discipline, and the specific grace of knowing when to wait. Don't spend it early. She hadn't. She looked out the window as the car turned toward Midtown. The building was already lit up from the outside, its windows warm and gold against the night sky. 300 people in there. Every one of them had been told, implicitly or explicitly, a particular story about who Linda Brown was. Would you treat them with kindness? Told it through seating arrangements and introductions, and 3 years of watching Patricia Johnson speak over her head in a language that was supposed to be private. Tonight, those same 300 people were going to find out what Patricia had missed. The car stopped. The driver came around. Linda took 1 breath. Not a deep, dramatic breath. Not the kind that signals that something significant is about to happen. Just a breath. The kind that means, I'm here, I'm ready. Let's go. She stepped out into the night air, looked up at the building. Then she walked in. The lobby of the Wilson Property Group's annual gala smelled like money, not a metaphor. The specific olfactory combination of fresh gardenias, dry cleaned wool, and whatever the catering staff had spritzed onto the linens to make them smell like a hotel that charged $400 a night. Linda had been to this event twice before. Both times in a black dress Patricia had subtly suggested, and a role that had been precisely outlined without anyone ever saying it out loud. Stand here. Smile there. Don't talk too much. Don't be too quiet. Be decorative without being distracting. Be present without being visible. Same room. Different woman walking into it. The dress got noticed immediately. Not in the way that causes a scene, in the way that causes a recalibration. A pause. A second look that the looker tries to make look like a first look. Linda had counted on this. Not because she needed to be looked at, because she needed people to be paying attention when she started talking, and a red dress in a room full of navy and black bought her exactly the 2 seconds of focus she'd need. Anthony was near the bar when she entered. She saw the exact moment he registered the color. His jaw didn't drop. He was too controlled for that. But something moved through his expression, with a brief tightening, a flicker of the unexpected, and then the practiced smooth reassembled itself, and he crossed the room toward her with a smile that was 90% social reflex and 10% genuine uncertainty. "Red," he said, and the single word held a question he wasn't willing to ask directly. "I thought it was time for something different." Her voice was level, warm even. "Would you treat them with kindness?" The smile she gave him was the one she'd perfected in the first year of this marriage, the one that lived in the corners of her mouth and went nowhere near her eyes, the one that read as pleasant to anyone who wasn't measuring the distance between expression and emotion. Anthony looked at her for a half-second longer than was comfortable. Then his phone buzzed, and the moment dissolved, and he was already turning back toward the room with the easy pivot of a man who had decided, consciously or not to investigate anything that might complicate his evening. So, that was fine. She hadn't expected him to investigate. She'd expected exactly that pivot. Patricia was at the far end of the venue, stationed near the podium in the particular way she stationed herself at these events, as if the room had an architectural center and she was it. White dress, pearls, the expression of a woman receiving guests at her own coronation. She saw Linda, the moment Linda cleared the entryway, and something crossed her face too. Briefer than Anthony's reaction. Harder to read. A small narrowing of assessment. Then the public face snapped back into place, and Patricia turned to the couple she'd been greeting and continued as if nothing had interrupted her. But it had. Linda had seen the interruption. Tiny as it was, she'd seen it. She had been watching this woman for 3 years, through the specific clarity that comes from being underestimated. Would you treat them with kindness? And she could read the architecture of Patricia Johnson's face, with a precision that Patricia would have found astonishing. If she'd ever thought Linda was worth being astonished by, she found James Carter near the third table from the left. Because James Carter was always near the third table from the left at these events, for reasons that had something to do with sightlines and exit proximity, that he had once explained to her in exactly 3 sentences and never mentioned again. He was in a charcoal suit, glass of sparkling water, the expression of a man who had decided 40 years ago that watching was more useful than talking, and had not once found reason to revise that conclusion. He saw her, gave the smallest nod, the kind that meant, "I see you. I'm positioned. We are go." She moved through the room slowly, not because she was hesitant, because moving slowly in a room full of people who expect you to be invisible is one of the most clarifying things you can do. It gives people time to look at you and then pretend they didn't. It gives you time to take inventory. Robert Williams was at table 7 with his team, because he was always at table 7 when he attended Wilson events. Same side of the table, same orientation to the room. He was in a confrontations, but his eyes tracked the room on a separate parallel circuit, the unconscious habit of a man accustomed to monitoring environments while appearing to be focused elsewhere. She'd noted this about him at the deal closing. She'd noted it in the way she noted everything precisely, without the noting showing on her face. Monica Reed was already inside. This had required coordination. Monica had a press credential as a business journalist, which was accurate. She did cover business, among other things. Would you treat them with kindness? And Wilson Property Group had sent her an invitation 3 weeks ago as part of their standard media outreach for the Gala, which was a satisfying kind of irony that Linda had appreciated when James told her about it. Monica was at a small table near the back of the room, laptop bag over one shoulder, the particular alert stillness of a journalist who is working while appearing to simply be attending. They had agreed not to make eye contact until it was time. Monica was already in position. Everything was in position. Except, would you treat them with kindness? except for that had cost been position, the thing that cost Linda 3 days of elevated pulse, and the worst night's sleep she'd had in a year. It had happened 5 weeks ago. The night she'd called Mary. She'd been tired. Not the ordinary tired of a long day, but the accumulated tired of 3 years of vigilance, of performing a version of herself that was smaller and slower and less than the actual version, of being present in a house where presence itself was a form of disappearance. She'd put her daughter to bed, and Anthony had been in Chicago, and Patricia had been at her Park Avenue apartment, and the house had been quiet in the way it was only occasionally quiet, and Linda had made the mistake of letting that quietness feel safe. She'd called Mary, which wasn't a mistake. Calling Mary was never a mistake. But what she'd done during the call, what she'd let herself do, was feel things she'd been managing for 3 years without letting them accumulate. She'd talked for 40 minutes, not about the plan. She never talked about the plan on the phone, but about everything around it. The tiredness, the specific loneliness of being surrounded by people who had decided to not see her. The way her daughter was starting to put words together in all 3 of the languages Linda spoke to her in private, and the terror that that came with knowing that this would eventually become visible and would be, in this household, treated as a problem. Mary had listened, and then Mary had done something she almost never did, which was to stop being steady and simply be there, raw and present, in the way that grandmothers are sometimes present, when they've run out of the energy to be anything other than honest. "I'm sorry, baby girl. I taught you to be strong for so long I forgot to tell you that you don't have to do it alone every single minute." And Linda had cried. Not loudly, not for long. But it was the first time in 14 months that she'd let herself do it, and the release of it had taken something out of her that left her slightly unmoored in a way she hadn't anticipated. Which was why, when she'd ended the call and opened her laptop to update a document she'd been compiling for Vanessa, she'd made the error. A simple error. The kind that happens when your hands are moving on habit and your focus has been redistributed somewhere else. She'd saved the file, in the shared drive, under a folder name that was clear enough to read in a 3-second glance. Wilson Case. Financial records compiled. She'd caught it 17 minutes later. Cold. Full system alert. She'd deleted it immediately, checked the trash, emptied it, checked the drive history, and found no evidence that Anthony had accessed the shared drive at all that evening. He was in Chicago. Patricia was across town. Nobody had seen it, but her hands had been cold for 3 days afterward, because the difference between nobody saw it and nobody saw it yet was the difference between everything being fine and everything being over. And she'd come closer to the second one than she'd come at any point in 3 years. And she'd gotten there because she'd let herself feel something for 40 minutes. She'd told Vanessa at their next meeting. Not because Vanessa needed to know, but because Linda had made a rule for herself at the beginning of this process. No undisclosed vulnerabilities. If something had happened that could affect the case, Vanessa knew about it. That was non-negotiable. Vanessa had listened, asked 3 specific questions about what the file contained and whether it was traceable to her other documentation, confirmed that the risk was contained, and then said, "You're human, Linda. That's not a liability. That's information about how much longer you can sustain this before you need it to be over." 3 weeks, Linda had said. Then 3 weeks. She was past the 3 weeks now. She was in the room, and the evening was about to begin. The call with Robert Williams' team 6 months ago came back to her in pieces as she found her assigned seat, which was where it had always been at these events, close enough to the proceedings to appear included, far enough from the center to remain peripheral. The call had been a Saturday morning. Anthony in his study, door less than halfway closed, the speaker volume turned up, because Anthony had stopped thinking of the house as a space where information needed to be managed. Why would he? Nobody in this house was listening. The error in the contract had been a translation problem. 15 to 50. One word in a subordinate clause of a 60-page commercial agreement. Would you treat them with kindness? A word that changed the revenue-sharing structure from a reasonable arrangement into something that Robert Williams's team would never accept and shouldn't have accepted. Linda had known the moment she heard Robert Williams's attorney start asking about the revenue clause, speaking in Spanish, pointed and increasingly cold, that the deal was 3 minutes from collapse. She'd known because she'd read the contract. She'd read it because Anthony had left it on the study desk for 4 days while he was working through it section by section, and because Linda passed that desk 6 times a day and she was, at her core, a person who read things. The note she'd slid under the door had been written in 30 seconds. Section number, page, the specific clause, the correct figure. She hadn't signed it. She hadn't needed to. Anthony had found it, recognized her handwriting, used it. Would you treat them with kindness? And then come to her in the kitchen afterward, with the expression of a man who has been slightly inconvenienced by being forced to revise a comfortable assumption. I Googled it. Clean. Simple. Completely plausible to someone who'd already decided what she was capable of. My wife, the Google detective. He'd said it with warmth, with the specific warmth of condescension that doesn't know it's condescending. Like patting a child on the head for correctly naming a color. She'd looked at him and said nothing. And later on the phone with Patricia, he'd told the story. The same way told those that involved told Linda doing something that should have been impressive, which was by making it smaller on the way out of his mouth, by placing it in a frame that fit his existing model. Luck. A stopped clock. A useful accident. Robert Williams had not interpreted it that way. She'd known he hadn't from the handshake at the deal closing. The quality of his attention. The way he'd said your family while looking at her. Robert Williams had been in too many rooms with too many people to mistake a stopped clock for a woman who knew exactly what time it was. Now she watched him from across the venue as the evening's program began. Would you treat them with kindness? As the Wilson Property Group's executive team took their positions and the lights shifted, and the MC introduced the company's leadership, and Patricia Johnson walked to the podium with the bearing of a woman who has never in her life questioned whether she deserved to be standing exactly where she is. She looked good. That had to be acknowledged. Patricia Johnson, at 65, was formidable in the way that very few people of any age manage to be formidable. The kind of presence that reorganizes a room's attention without effort. She gripped the sides of the podium with a light authority, looked out at 300 people who were, in various configurations, financially or professionally connected to the Wilson family, and began. The speech was in English. Mostly. Patricia's public speeches were always mostly in English, because these were professional events with mixed audiences. But she had a habit, deeply embedded by now, of dropping into Spanish for particular phrases, for what she called emphasis, the way certain people code switch for rhetorical effect. She'd done it at every gala Linda had attended. It had always read, at these events, as sophisticated multilingualism, the moneyed affectation of a woman who moved in international business circles. It was also, Linda had always understood, a performance with a specific secondary audience. The Spanish phrases Patricia chose at public events were always slightly too precise to be accidental. Would you treat them with kindness? They were chosen the way a person chooses them when they've been choosing them in private for years and have gotten comfortable with the confidence that a particular person in the audience doesn't understand. Patricia moved through the speech with the ease of someone who'd given a version of it many times. The company's history. 3 generations of building something meaningful. The expansion into new markets, the commitment to community. Anthony standing to the side, looking appropriate and composed. Stephanie next to him, smiling on cue. Then the pivot. Linda had expected it. She'd heard variations of it at both previous galas. Patricia's conclusion, always turned warm and personal, always made a gesture toward family. And that gesture always included Linda in the specific way that things can be inclusive while simultaneously being diminishing. And of course, Patricia said, and her voice shifted into the register she used when she wanted to sound generous. My daughter-in-law Linda, who has been with this family for 3 years now. A hand extended toward the front row where Linda was seated. 300 faces oriented. She sits here tonight and she is, I want to say this genuinely, exactly what this family has always believed in. Opening our table, widening our circle, A pause. A smile directed at Linda that contained, underneath its public warmth, a specific message that only one person in the room was equipped to decode. Then in Spanish, slipped in beneath the English like a card dealt face down. She smiles. She is here. She understands nothing, as usual, which is, honestly, what makes these evenings possible. Light laughter from the few people in the room who caught the Spanish. Not because they understood the content, because code switching at a podium by a powerful woman reads as sophistication, and people laugh at sophistication even when they haven't understood the joke. Patricia stepped back from the podium, and that was when Linda Brown stood up.
Not fast.
Not with the energy of someone reacting, with the deliberate, unhurried intention of someone executing a plan that had been in place for a long time. She didn't look at Anthony. She didn't look at Patricia. She looked at the podium, and she moved toward it. And the room did what rooms do when someone does something unexpected at a formal event. It registered the anomaly before the anomaly had fully declared itself, a ripple of redirected attention, a collective lean, a suspension of the ambient murmur that is always present at these things. Patricia saw her moving. The smile did something complicated, held, but differently. A question entered her posture. Anthony shifted in his peripheral vision. Stephanie's hand stopped moving toward her glass. Linda stepped up to the podium, adjusted the microphone with the calm precision of someone who had done this before, which she had. Looked out at the room. 300 faces, directed at her, completely. And then she said, in Spanish, the kind of Spanish that doesn't require translation to be recognized as fluent, the kind that lands in the body before the brain has finished processing. Thank you, Patricia. Genuinely. 3 years of speaking freely in front of me has given me more than you know. Because I understood every word. The room went somewhere that wasn't quite silence. Silence implies an absence. This was the opposite. This was a presence. A collective held breath. The sensation of 300 people arriving simultaneously at the edge of something they hadn't seen coming. Patricia didn't move, which was, in its own way, more revealing than movement would have been. Linda continued in Spanish, measured, unflinching. The voice of a woman who had spent 3 years learning exactly what she wanted to say and how she wanted to say it. La decoración. That's what you called me. The decoration. I heard it the first time on a Sunday 4 months after the wedding. You were passing the bread. She looked at Patricia directly. You didn't lower your voice. You had no reason to. I was furniture. Furniture doesn't listen. Stephanie had gone very still. Anthony had risen halfway from his seat, and then not completed the motion. He was suspended in the indeterminate posture of someone whose body has offered 2 options and whose mind hasn't yet chosen between them. La decoración hears everything, Linda said. For 3 years. She paused, let it land. Then in English, would you treat them with kindness? Shifting registers the way she'd learned to shift them before she'd learned to read. Fluid and purposeful. My name is Linda Brown. I hold a degree from Howard University, with highest honors. I speak Spanish and Mandarin fluently. I have understood every conversation in this household, in this company, and at every table where your family believed they were speaking privately, in front of someone who couldn't follow. Anthony found his voice. Linda, this isn't the place. The words came out controlled, calibrated to sound like concern, like a husband managing a situation. But they were too late and too thin, and the room heard the thinness. Sit down, Anthony. Not loud, not theatrical, simply certain. The certainty of a woman who had earned the right to that sentence through 3 years of not saying it. He didn't sit, but he didn't speak again. Behind the room, Monica Reed's laptop was connected to the venue's presentation system through a cable she'd run during the pre-event setup. Would you treat them with kindness? While the catering staff were still arranging chairs and nobody was paying attention to a journalist with a press pass organizing her equipment. The screen behind the podium, which had been displaying the Wilson Property Group logo, changed. A bank statement. Date in the upper right corner. Account number partially obscured. Transfer amount, $2.4 million. 3 days after Anthony and Linda's wedding date. This is an account that was not disclosed during our marriage. Linda's voice didn't waver. This is not the only one. In total, there are 4 accounts containing assets that were never reported as marital property. The combined value, as of last quarter, exceeds $11 million. Another document, an email thread. Anthony's name in the sender field. His attorney's name in the recipient field. A subject line reading, in plain language that required no interpretation. Prenuptial strategy. Linda B. Exposure minimization. The prenuptial agreement I signed was prepared with the specific intention of ensuring I would have no legal foundation to contest it. I had 12 minutes with a legal aid attorney before signing a 47-page document. She looked at the room, not at the documents, at the people, at 300 faces in various states of reckoning with what they were seeing. 12 minutes. Another document. Text messages between Anthony and Patricia. A thread from 14 months ago. Linda didn't read the messages out loud. She didn't need to. They were on the screen, legible, dated, between 2 people who had expected those words to remain exactly where private words live. Would you treat them with kindness? Which is in the private space that you lose access to when you've been having your most important conversations in a room where someone who understands every syllable has been quietly documenting them. Patricia turned toward the exit, not running. Patricia Johnson had never run from anything in her life, and she wasn't starting now. But she was moving, with intent, with the specific intent of a woman who understands that distance is her only remaining option. Monica Reed was standing at the exit, press badge visible, not blocking the way. She had no authority to block anything, just standing there, notebook open, pen in her left hand. The patient stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for exactly this moment, Mrs. Johnson. I have a few questions about the financial disclosures referenced in tonight's presentation. Whenever you're ready. Patricia stopped. Monica had been working the Wilson Property Group story for 6 months before Linda Brown called her. She'd had pieces of it. Would you treat them with kindness? The kind of pieces you can see the shape of, but can't assemble into anything publishable because they're missing the connective tissue of inside information, of documentation from within the structure itself. When James Carter had passed her Linda's contact information with nothing more than call her, trust me, Monica had been skeptical. Skepticism was a professional requirement. She'd called. She'd listened. She'd asked the questions she always asked, specific and ungentle. The kind that sought sources who actually know things from sources who believe they know things. Linda had answered every question with a precision that came from having anticipated the questions, which came from having spent 3 years preparing for a moment when precision would matter more than anything else. 2 weeks of independent verification, cross-referencing, source confirmation, document authentication through channels that had nothing to do with Linda Brown and everything to do with Monica's 6 months of prior reporting. The story had been ready for 9 days. It was going to run regardless of tonight, but tonight had given it something no amount of reporting could manufacture, which was a primary source willing to speak in public, on the record, in front of witnesses. 300 witnesses, several of whom were already filming on their phones. James Carter had not moved from his position at table 3. Would you treat them with kindness? He had watched the entire progression with the expression of a man who had placed a considered bet and was watching it pay out in a way that was more complete than he'd anticipated, but not more than he'd thought possible. When Linda paused, when the room was still suspended in its collective reckoning, he stood up, slowly, and began to clap. Not applause in the theatrical sense. The deliberate acknowledgement of someone who is communicating something specific to a specific room. I see this. I recognize what this is. I am not pretending otherwise. 1 person near him joined. Then 3 more. Would you treat them with kindness? Then the ripple moved through the room in the way that these things move through rooms when the social permission has been established, when 1 person of sufficient credibility has signaled that the response is appropriate. And it became something that filled the space entirely. Robert Williams stood at table 7. He crossed the room in the particular way of a man who moves with intention rather than haste, and he stepped up to the stage, and he would treat them with kindness, and he extended his hand to Linda Brown with the directness of someone who has arrived at a decision, and is not interested in performing ambiguity about it. Miss Brown. I came tonight to continue a business relationship with this company, but I think I've been in conversation with the wrong person for the last 18 months. He held her hand for an additional moment, a beat longer than a standard handshake. I'd like to schedule a meeting. With you. Anthony moved toward the stage. Would you treat them with kindness? Two of the venue's security staff, who had been tracking the situation for the past several minutes with the professional attention of people paid to anticipate rather than react, stepped into his path in a way that wasn't aggressive and didn't need to be. His forward motion stopped. He looked at the room, at his mother near the exit, standing in a conversation she hadn't agreed to have, at his sister, still at the table, her hand finally having completed its original journey to her glass, holding it without drinking, at James Carter, standing, still clapping, the most quietly devastating thing in the room, at Linda at the podium, in the red dress, looking back at him. He had a look on his face that she hadn't seen before. In 3 years, across 100 dinners and 200 small daily interactions, and one wedding where he'd held her hand at an altar, she had never seen this specific arrangement of his features. It took her a moment to identify it because she'd never had occasion to look for it in him. He was seeing her. Actually, finally fully seeing her. And the expression it produced was not the one she might have hoped for in a different version of this story. It was not remorse or recognition or the belated arrival of something real. It was something smaller and more honest than any of those. It was the stunned blank expression of a man who has just understood that he has been profoundly wrong for a long time and does not yet have any idea what to do with that information. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked away, not because she owed him the drama of a longer look, because she had spent too much of herself inside this story already, and she was not going to spend one more second of it on his process. She had other things to attend to. The venue was doing the thing that venues do when something unscripted has happened at a formal event, a kind of organized uncertainty, small clusters of conversation forming and reforming, phones appearing, the catering staff caught between their protocols and the human instinct to stop and watch. The Wilson Property Group's communications director was making a beeline for someone on her phone, face tight, the specific expression of a professional whose evening has become a crisis management situation. Would you treat them with kindness? A board member Linda recognized from Anthony's office holiday party was standing with 2 other people she didn't recognize, the 3 of them in a configuration that looked like the beginning of a decision. Monica Reed, no longer at the exit because Patricia was still at the exit and Monica was doing what journalists do, which was follow where the information was going, had a phone to her ear and was speaking quietly. She'd have photographers outside. She'd have editors on standby. The piece was going to run by midnight. Linda knew this because Monica had told her exactly what the timeline would look like, and Monica was a woman who operated on timelines with the same discipline. Linda operated on everything. James Carter appeared at Linda's shoulder, quietly, the way he did most things. You doing all right? Yes. And she was. She was precisely all right. In the specific way that a person is all right when they have done the thing they needed to do and have not yet had to process what comes next. The processing would come. It was already queuing up somewhere behind her sternum, the accumulated weight of 3 years of watching and waiting and performing and documenting. Would you treat them with kindness? The weight of a marriage that had been a transaction and a house that had never been a home and a daughter she had spent 27 months protecting from an atmosphere that wanted to diminish her. All of that was still there, still arriving, still real, but it was behind her right now. Right now there was only this room, and she was standing in it, and everyone in it finally knew who she was. The board member at table 12, James said quietly, Gerald Thomas. He's been uncomfortable with the company's financial reporting for 8 months. He needed a reason to move on it. I believe you just gave him one. She looked toward table 12. Gerald Thomas was on his phone, the expression of a man who had decided. Good, she said. Stephanie Harris had not moved from her seat. She was the one person in the room whose reaction Linda hadn't been able to predict, because Stephanie was not Patricia, not Anthony, not one of the peripheral Wilsons who existed mostly as backdrop in Linda's 3 years of documentation. Stephanie was 32 and had spent her whole life orbiting her mother's certainty, using it as a kind of gravitational field that organized her own direction. Without that certainty as a fixed point, the orbit became unclear. She looked, sitting there with her still full glass, like someone who had been handed a map and discovered that the city it described did not match the one they were actually in. Linda did not cross the room to her. Not tonight, but she noted it. The way Stephanie had gone still, rather than following Patricia toward the exit. The way her eyes tracked Linda, rather than the room's other dramas. There was something in that stillness that was different from the stillness of complicity. Would you treat them with kindness? It was the stillness of someone recalibrating from the ground up, and that was a process that would take longer than one evening. Linda filed it without judgment and turned back to the room. Robert Williams was speaking with James Carter now, the two of them in the easy collaborative register of men who've known each other across many deals and are aligning on something new. She could see from their body language that the conversation was substantive, that it was moving somewhere. Substantive? Robert Williams was the kind of man who made decisions in real time and didn't spend energy on the performance of deliberation after the decision was already made. He'd decided something when she shook his hand. He was now in the process of discussing what that decision looked like in practice. Patricia Johnson had not left the building. Monica Reed was still near the exit, professionally patient, notebook in her left hand. Would you treat them with kindness? Patricia had the look of a woman who has been in difficult rooms before and knows that the worst thing you can do in a difficult room is appear to be fleeing it. She was speaking to someone, a woman Linda didn't recognize, composed on the outside, in the way that had always been Patricia's great skill. Would you treat them with kindness? But there was something underneath the composure that Linda could see from across the room. The slight over-precision of a person who is managing their face rather than simply inhabiting it. Which was, Linda thought, how she herself had looked for 3 years at every Sunday dinner. Vanessa Carter had not been in the room tonight. They'd agreed on this. Vanessa's presence would have signaled, to anyone who knew her professional reputation, that this was legally coordinated, which it was, but which didn't need to be visible until it needed to be visible. Vanessa was at her office. She had been at her office since 7 this evening, phone on, files open, everything prepared for what would begin tomorrow morning when Linda called her and said, "Start the clock." She would make that call in the car on the way home. Would you treat them with kindness? The events of the next hours had a certain inevitability to them, the way things do when they've been carefully constructed in advance and are now simply unfolding through a sequence that was always going to look like this from the inside. Anthony was escorted to a secondary room by the venue manager and 2 security staff. Not detained, not arrested. Would you treat them with kindness? Simply removed from the public space of the event in the way that formal venues manage disruptions when they've made a professional judgment about where the disruption is located. He went without physical resistance. She'd expected that. Anthony's instinct in adversarial situations was always to reassess rather than escalate. Would you treat them with kindness? To look for the angle that might still work. And in this particular situation there was no such angle, which meant he would spend the next several hours understanding that, rather than doing anything useful about it. Stephanie left through a side exit 20 minutes after her brother. Alone. Without speaking to Patricia. Linda noted this too. Gerald Thomas and 2 other board members were in a cluster that had been growing for 40 minutes. Their conversation now, including Wilson Property Group's general counsel, would you treat them with kindness? Who had arrived looking like someone who'd received a text and driven across town in the specific controlled panic that attorneys experience when they understand the magnitude of what they're about to spend their professional energy on. James Carter came back to her. Monica's running the piece tonight. Full investigation. 12 months of reporting. He paused. It's thorough. I know. I read a draft. He gave her the look he sometimes gave her, the one that acknowledged something without making a speech of it. What do you need right now? What she needed was to call her daughter. Would you treat them with kindness? Her daughter, who was asleep in an apartment in Brooklyn, where Linda had moved her things 2 weeks ago, in the unhurried, methodical way of someone who had been planning the logistics of departure for considerably longer than 2 weeks. One bag at a time. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would be noticed. Would you treat them with kindness? Until the Brooklyn apartment was a functional home and the Upper East Side house was a place where she still slept, but where her actual life no longer resided. Would you treat them with kindness? She needed to hear her daughter's breathing through the baby monitor app on her phone. She needed to stand in the lobby of this building for 1 minute without anyone requiring anything of her. She needed to call Mary Smith and say, in the layered language that was the oldest part of who she was, "It's done. I need 5 minutes," she told James. "Then I'll be ready for whatever comes next." He nodded, moved away. She walked to a corner of the lobby that was temporarily out of the main traffic flow of the room, people still moving, conversations still restructuring, the events program now entirely abandoned in favor of the more immediate and compelling event that had replaced it. She took out her phone, checked the baby monitor. Her daughter, asleep, tiny fists curled, the completely unconscious certainty of a 2-year-old who has not yet been told she should be smaller. She called Mary. Mary answered on the second ring despite the hour, because Mary Smith had been waiting for this call since the night she'd said don't spend it early. Would you treat them with kindness? Had been waiting with the particular patience of someone who planted a seed a long time ago and has been watching the soil with the quiet confidence of someone who knows what's in it. Linda said, in the full 3-language blend that was her actual voice, "It's done, Grandma." And Mary Smith, 83 years old, on a phone in Louisiana, in a house whose porch still leaned because there was always something more urgent, exhaled with the sound of someone releasing a breath they had been holding for 3 years. 3 years. "I know, baby girl." Her voice was steady, more resolve than hope. No, more than that. Certainty. The specific certainty of a woman who had given her granddaughter a loaded sentence on the night before a wedding, and had never once doubted that the granddaughter would know exactly what to do with it when the time came. "I've known." Linda stood in the corner of the lobby of a midtown Manhattan building, in a red dress, while 3 people rearranged everything they thought they understood about who she was, and she felt, for the first time in 3 years, something she hadn't realized she'd been without. Not victory, not relief, not even vindication, though all of those were present in some measure. Room. The feeling of taking up the actual space that she had always occupied, and had always until now been asked to pretend she wasn't. She put the phone in her clutch, smoothed the front of the red dress, looked at the room. Then she walked back into it. The morning after the gala, Linda Brown woke up in Brooklyn. Not the Upper East Side. Brooklyn. The apartment she'd been quietly assembling for 6 weeks, 1 bag at a time. Nothing dramatic. Just the slow and deliberate transfer of a life from a place that had never truly held it into a place that actually could. The bedroom was smaller. The ceiling was lower. The windows faced east and let in morning light that arrived without apology, warm and direct, landing on a floor that was hers, in a space that was hers, inside a version of the world that she had built on her own terms. She lay there for exactly 4 minutes before her daughter made a sound in the next room. Not crying, just the specific small noise of a 2-year-old announcing consciousness to the world, the conversational waking up noise of a child who has not yet learned that mornings require performance. Linda got up, padded to the doorway, stood there, looking at her daughter in the portable crib, both arms already reaching upward before the eyes had fully opened, because 2-year-olds operate on the certainty that when they reach, someone reaches back. Linda crossed the room and picked her up, held her for a moment, her daughter's small weight against her chest, warm and completely present in the way that only the very young are completely present, unencumbered by anything that had happened yesterday, or the day before, or across 3 years of Zundessing, in a house that smelled like fresh flowers and felt like the inside of a lock. "Good morning," Linda said, in all 3. The way she always said it when nobody was there to require her to say it differently. Her daughter put both hands on Linda's face, looked at her, then said with the confidence of someone making a very important point, "Mama, eat which?" Yes, that was the right order of priorities. She made scrambled eggs and cut strawberries into small pieces while her daughter sat in the portable high chair and offered running commentary on the strawberries in what appeared to be a mixture of English and something that might have been Spanish or might have been its own entirely original language that was still in development. Linda listened to all of it. She did not correct any of it. She let the language grow in whatever direction it needed to grow, because that was the whole point. That was always the whole point. That the people we come from give us language as a gift and not a cage. And what you do with that gift is build with it, build towards something, build in the direction of the life you actually want. Her phone had been face down on the kitchen counter since she'd arrived home the night before. She'd made 3 calls: Vanessa, James, Mary. In that order. She'd given Vanessa the confirmation to begin filing. She'd told James that Robert Williams had already sent a message through his assistant requesting a meeting, and that she'd respond in the morning when her head was clearer. She'd told Mary good night in the 3-language blend, and listened to her grandmother's voice settle into the warm particular register that it went to when Mary Smith was completely at peace with how a thing had turned out. Then she'd put the phone down and gone to sleep. She turned it over now, while the eggs cooled, while her daughter investigated a strawberry with forensic seriousness. The screen had 17 notifications. She looked at them in the order they mattered, not in the order they'd arrived. Vanessa first. Sent at 7:42 in the morning, which meant Vanessa had been at her desk since at least 7. Preliminary filing complete. Anthony's team has already been in contact. 8 attorneys on their side as of this morning. Expected. Call me when you're ready. 8, right. 8 was the number you deployed when you were trying to win through volume rather than substance. 8 attorneys meant intimidation as a strategy, meant the expectation that the others would look at the numerical disparity and make an unfavorable calculation about sustainability. Anthony's team understood one thing very well, which was that the resources available to them were vastly greater than what most opposing parties could match, and that legal wars of attrition tended to resolve in favor of whoever had more stamina and more money. What they did not yet understand, because they had been operating on an outdated model of who Linda Brown was that she had both. Monica's piece had run at 11:50 the previous night. She texted a link with no additional message, because no additional message was needed. Linda opened the article, 12,000 words. Every figure verified. Every document described with the precision of someone who had spent 6 months building the framework, before Linda handed her the center. The headline was measured and specific in the way that serious journalism is measured and specific, not inflammatory, not sensational, just accurate. The hidden accounts. How Wilson Property Group concealed assets across 4 years of financial disclosures. Not a personal story, a financial one, which was correct. Which was how it needed to be positioned to have the impact that would matter. Because the personal story was Linda's to tell if and when she chose. But the financial story, the story of a company that had misrepresented its asset structure to investors and business partners, that was everyone's story. That was the story that would move the board. That was the story that would move the markets. By 8 in the morning, the article had been shared widely enough that it was appearing in the financial news aggregators that the people who mattered in New York commercial real estate read before their coffee finished brewing. By 9, Wilson Property Group's stock, which was partially public, had dropped 11% and was still moving. By 10, 2 of the company's 3 largest institutional investors had issued statements indicating they were reviewing their positions. Not a collapse, not yet, but the kind of movement that makes the next set of moves visible. Would you treat them with kindness? Vanessa had been right about what to expect from Anthony's team, and Linda had been right to expect Vanessa to be right. The 8 attorneys filed 3 motions in the first 48 hours, all procedural, all designed to slow the process and establish complexity. Would you treat them with kindness? They challenged the admissibility of the Gala recordings on grounds that the venue's audio equipment had been accessed without authorization. which was both legally incorrect and strategically transparent, since Monica's piece had already run, and the recordings were not the primary evidence anyway. They challenged the photograph documents on chain of custody grounds that Vanessa dismantled in a response brief filed the same afternoon. They requested delays. They filed for discovery extensions. They moved in the pattern of people who have won by exhaustion before, and see no reason to assume this time will be different. Linda sat with Vanessa on the third day. Not in Vanessa's formal conference room, but in her smaller office, the one with the good light, the one where Vanessa kept a photograph of her mother on the desk and a law school diploma on the wall that faced away from visitors, rather than toward them. Vanessa laid out the three-dimensional picture with the directness that had made Linda trust her from the first meeting. They're going to try to make this cost more than it's worth. That's the calculation. They have more. They'll spend more. And at some point, they'll expect you to do the math and settle. Linda considered this. What does the math actually say? The math says you have something they don't have, which is the prenuptial challenge. If we can void the prenup, the settlement calculus changes entirely. And the prenup challenge is strong. The 12-minute meeting, the complexity of the document, the email from Anthony's attorney describing the design intent. Those three things together constitute a prima facie case for fraud in the inducement. How long? To void it. Could be 60 days. Could be 6 months. Depends on how hard they fight it, and which judge we draw, and custody. Vanessa's expression shifted into something more precise. Custody was where she became most careful, because custody was where the stakes were not financial. They're going to argue instability, the gala, the recordings, the whole structure of what you did. They'll call it erratic. A woman who documents 3 years of evidence and chooses a public venue with 300 witnesses and a verified journalist is the opposite of erratic. Vanessa allowed herself a small, sharp smile. That is exactly what I intend to say. Multiple times. To multiple judges. She did. Vanessa Carter did not believe in saving her best arguments for later when deploying them early could establish the framing. Would you treat them with kindness? She argued the custody case with the thoroughness of someone who had anticipated every counter-argument and had a prepared response for each one before it arrived. Would you treat them with kindness? The opposing characterization of Linda as emotionally volatile broke against the documented record of Linda's conduct with the specific futility of a wave against something that has been built to withstand it. 3 years of dated journal entries. Time-stamped recordings. A pattern of behavior that was, as Vanessa described it to the court, the opposite of impulsive, constituting instead the most methodical and patient exercise of legal self-protection this court is likely to encounter. The custody hearing ran across 4 sessions over 6 weeks. Linda attended all of them in the same manner she attended everything consequential, fully present, completely composed, wearing the stillness that had been trained into her by 3 years of needing it, and that now, deployed in a courtroom, rather than a Sunday dinner, read not as passivity, but as exactly what it was, complete self-possession. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, who had been on the family court bench for 17 years and had, in the opinion of everyone who practiced before her regularly, a tolerance for nonsense that had gone below zero approximately a decade ago. She listened to Anthony's team's characterization of Linda with an expression that did not shift in any visible way, which, Vanessa had warned Linda, meant she was storing rather than reacting. Filing treat them with kindness, informations and with the precision of someone who would assemble it into a conclusion when she was ready and not before, Anthony testified. Would you treat them with kindness? His version of events had a particular quality that Linda recognized from 3 years of watching him operate in professional settings, which was that it was internally consistent, smoothly delivered, and optimized for the impression it made rather than the accuracy of what it contained. He described Linda as someone he'd tried to support, who had developed, in his characterization, an inexplicable grievance that had escalated into what he called a calculated public attack designed to damage his family's reputation and their daughter's stability. He used those words with the practiced concern of a man who had been coached on how to use them. Linda sat at the plaintiff's table and looked at the middle distance and noted, for the final time in her life, the precise quality of Anthony Wilson's performance of caring about something. Then she testified, quietly, specifically, the dates and the statements and the documentation. She did not characterize. She described. She let the record characterize itself. At one point the judge asked her directly, "Why did you wait 3 years?" And Linda said the truest thing she knew, "Because I needed to understand my position fully before I was willing to defend it, and because I was protecting my daughter from a conflict that wasn't hers to carry." The judge wrote something down, said nothing, moved to the next question. The ruling came on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the first hearing. Linda was in the Brooklyn apartment when Vanessa called. Her daughter was in the other room rearranging a set of wooden blocks with the focused intensity of someone who has identified a structural problem and has thoughts about the solution. Vanessa said, "Full custody. Anthony has supervised visitation for the first 6 months, subject to review." A pause. The judge wrote 6 words in the determination. "I'm going to read them to you exactly." She did. The only instability was the marriage. Linda sat down on the edge of the couch. 6 words, precise and devastating in the economy of them, the way only legally binding language can be precise and devastating, because it carries the weight of finality that ordinary sentences don't have. She stayed on the couch for about a minute, not crying, not celebrating, just letting the 6 words be exactly what they were. "Would you treat them with kindness?" Then her daughter came around the corner with a wooden block in each hand and held one out to Linda with the expression of someone making a very generous offer, and Linda took it, and they sat on the floor together and rebuilt whatever the blocks were becoming. The prenuptial agreement took longer, 62 days from first filing to ruling, which was on the faster end of what Vanessa had projected, and was attributable in part to the specificity of the evidence and in part to the fact that Anthony's team, having stretched their resources across 4 simultaneous legal fronts, "Would you treat them with kindness?" had begun to show the particular signs of thinning that happen when you've deployed volume as a strategy and the volume hasn't worked. The prenup ruling was unambiguous. Fraud in the inducement, failure of independent legal representation, concealment of material assets. The agreement was voided in full. The settlement negotiation that followed was a different kind of thing. Harder in some ways than the courtroom, because settlements happen in the space between what each side knows is true and what each side can afford to see become public. And that space in this kindness was occupied by a great deal of information that Anthony's team had a significant professional interest in keeping out of additional litigation. They settled. It took 11 days of back and forth, conducted entirely through attorneys, during which Linda did not speak to Anthony or Patricia or anyone on their side directly. The final figure was not what the original prenuptial agreement had specified, which had been designed to be almost nothing, but what 3 years of marriage, documented and contested, and 4 concealed accounts totaling $11.3 million, court acknowledged and partially forfeited, actually produced when evaluated under New York's equitable distribution framework. Would you treat them with kindness? She did not count the money the way someone counts a victory. She counted it the way someone counts air after they've been underwater, not as triumph but as evidence that you were right to believe you could surface. Wilson Property Group did not collapse cleanly. Companies of that size and structure rarely do. What they did was contract, shed, and reorganize, the corporate equivalent of a person trying to become a smaller target. 3 of the 5 major institutional investors reduced their positions in the first quarter after the article. Gerald Thomas and 1 other board member resigned. The third, who had issued the cautiously worded public statement, stayed. "You treat them with kindness," and began the process of what the company's official communications called a governance review, which was the language that boards use when they've understood that something went wrong and are trying to determine whether they were complicit or merely adjacent. That process was ongoing. It would be ongoing for a long time. Patricia resigned from the Fontaine Foundation board under conditions that the press release described as voluntary. Anthony remained in a diminished executive role, restructured, supervised. his authority now accountable to the governance committee in a way it had never been when Patricia's informal oversight was the only check on it. This was not a satisfying ending in the sense that endings in stories are sometimes satisfying. It was a realistic one. The system had moved, not as fast as it should have, not as completely as the facts merited, but it had moved. The record was clear. The accountability, such as it was established. The pattern that had operated invisibly for years was now permanently visible. James Carter's call came on a Friday in what was by then 3 months after the gala. He asked if she'd be available the following Tuesday for a meeting at his offices, and she said yes. And when she arrived, he had Robert Williams on the call along with 2 of Robert's team members, and a woman named Denise Bryant, who was introduced as the head of a real estate investment group that had been looking for a specific kind of advisory capacity for about 8 months. The meeting ran 2 hours. Linda had come prepared because she came prepared for everything, with a 1-page overview of the consulting structure she'd been building since before the gala, a framework she'd been designing in the same mental space where most people keep their daydreams, in the margins of other things, during the long hours of a marriage that had required her to inhabit its surface without being permitted to inhabit its substance. Brown Consulting Group was incorporated 11 days after that meeting. Not a grand launch, not a press release or an event. A filing, a business account at a bank where Linda had a personal account. A single-page website that James's assistant helped her set up, and that was, for the first 30 days, only findable by people who'd been given the URL directly. This was intentional. She was not interested in momentum, built on the story of what she'd survived. Would you treat them with kindness? She was interested in building something on the strength of what she could do. Those were different foundations, and she had spent enough of her life on foundations that were not what they appeared to be, to care very much about starting from something solid. Robert Williams's engagement was the first. Formal. Contracted. With kindness? Multilingual market development advisory for 3 new commercial projects in neighborhoods across the 5 boroughs that had historically been underserved by the kind of investment his group was now trying to bring in. Linda spoke with the community stakeholders directly, in Spanish with some, in English with others, in the specific mixture of registers and idioms and cultural fluency that no amount of formal training produces but that grows, organically and irreversibly, in people who have actually lived inside multiple linguistic worlds. Would you treat them with kindness? She understood not just the language but the architecture of trust that was required before a community that had been burned by outside investment before would agree to engage with it again. Would you treat them with kindness? She understood this because she had spent her life studying exactly this, because she had grown up knowing what it felt like to be on the other side of a table where the people across from you assumed they understood your world better than you did. She was not that kind of consultant. She was the other kind. The kind who listened first and had the credibility to be heard when she spoke because the listening had been real. Denise Bryant's group became the second client 2 months in. Then a third. A communications firm trying to build authentic relationships with Spanish-speaking consumer markets in New York and Miami. Would you treat them with kindness? Who had found Linda through Robert's recommendation, and who arrived at the first meeting with the slightly sheepish energy of people who knew they'd been doing something wrong and wanted to do it differently. Would you treat them with kindness? She worked with them with the same methodical patience she'd applied to everything, because the point was not to perform virtue but to build capacity, to create something that would still be working after she wasn't in the room. 12 employees. By month 10, she'd hired them with a single criterion, which was that they were genuinely excellent at what they did, and that their excellence had been systematically overlooked by the institutions that should have recognized it. Would you treat them with kindness? She had no official policy on this. She didn't need one. She simply knew what it looked like. The excellence that exists in people who've been told to make themselves smaller, because she had been one of those people, and she knew exactly what it felt like to finally be in a room that was sized correctly for what you actually were. The scholarship took longer to formalize. Would you treat them with kindness? She'd known from early in the consulting work that she wanted to do it, had known it in the specific way that people know things that come from gratitude rather than strategy. Mary Smith had given her language, had given her the tool that had built everything, that had documented everything, that had ultimately been the reason she was standing in the position she was standing in. Not the drama of the gala, that was the moment, but the language was the architecture. The language was the house inside the house, the thing that had kept her whole when the external house was trying to make her nothing. She named it the Mary Smith Language Fellowship. Full tuition, full support, no qualifying criteria beyond demonstrated genuine aptitude in multilingual study, available to students at historically black colleges and universities. The first cohort was 6 students. She announced it at a small gathering in the Brooklyn apartment. Mary on the phone from Louisiana, because Mary was 83 and not traveling, but Mary's voice was in the room, filling the corners of it, warm and rough with everything it had carried and given away, and chosen to carry again. When Linda told her the name of the fellowship, Mary was quiet for a moment, long enough that Linda started to speak again. Then Mary said, No, hush. I'm just sitting with it a minute. So Linda hushed, and they sat with it together, across 1,000 miles of phone line, in 2 different buildings, at 2 different ages, with the same language between them. The first recipient was a 19-year-old from New Orleans. Would you treat them with kindness? 3 languages, a childhood that had looked from the outside like it shouldn't have produced what it had produced, which was a young woman of exceptional precision and reach who had simply never been given the room to develop what she carried. She came to New York for her first semester at Howard on a Tuesday in September, and Linda met her on campus, and they walked across the quad together in the bright early fall light, and they talked in the 3-language blend that was Linda's native tongue, and that the young woman navigated with a fluency that made Linda feel, in the cleanest possible way, that something had been given forward rather than simply recovered. She told her, at the end of the walk, one thing, not a speech, just a sentence, said with the particular care of someone who has learned the value of precise language and doesn't waste it. You don't have to make yourself smaller to fit into a room. The room is the problem. Build bigger rooms. The young woman looked at her, nodded once, the nod of someone who has been waiting to be told a specific thing and has now been told it. Then she went to class. 8 months after the gala, on a Tuesday evening in early summer, Linda sat on the balcony of the Brooklyn apartment, with her daughter on her lap and the Manhattan skyline visible in the middle distance, the buildings catching the last of the day's light and holding it the way cities hold light, transformed into something warmer and more interesting than ordinary illumination. Would you treat them with kindness? Her daughter was asking questions in the running multilingual stream that had become her normal mode of communication. A question about a bird, a question about the color of the sky, a question that might have been with kindness, that might have been about dinner, or might have been about something entirely abstract that didn't have a name yet. Linda answered all of them, in all 3, without choosing, without performing, without the particular compressed feeling of someone deciding what language is safe. Then she started to sing, not because anything had been resolved, and she felt the metaphorical weight of resolution lifting, but because her daughter had started to move to some rhythm only she could hear, and because the song was there, the one from Mary, the one that had been passed through hands that Linda had never held, and voices she'd never heard, and years she had no access to, except through the language itself. She sang it the way it was meant to be sung, fully, clearly, in the air of the city in the evening on a balcony in Brooklyn, where nobody was going to tell her to stop. Her daughter stopped moving to the internal rhythm and looked up, listened, clapped, small hands, certain. Linda kept singing. She did not think about what the song meant. She did not think about what it had cost, or what it had built, or what came before it. She simply sang it, the way you do the things that were given to you by people who loved you without condition, which is without analysis and without distance, directly and completely, because that is the only way that things given with love are supposed to be used, which is, with the full weight of who you are. She sang until her daughter fell asleep. Then she kept singing, softly, for herself, because the language was hers, because it had always been hers. Kindness. Because the 3 years of Sunday dinners and the 14 seats and the white linen and the voices talking over her head about what she couldn't understand had not taken it, and the prenup hadn't taken it, and the 8 attorneys hadn't taken it, and the plan that had been in motion since that closed study door on a Saturday evening hadn't taken it either. Because some things are not available to be taken. Some things are built too deep in the body of a person to be reached by anything external. Some you treat them with kindness before you were old enough to understand what you were being given, and what those things do over the course of a life is wait. They wait until the right room, and then they speak.